He moved into the neighborhood because it was quiet, was the main reason. After many years of working long hours and dealing with noise, crowds, and stress, he wanted a place where days moved slowly and nights were calm. The houses were neat. The lawns were trimmed and people mostly minded their own business. At least that was how it seemed in the beginning. His house sat near the end of a clean street with wide sidewalks and tall trees. It was not the biggest house on the block, but it was comfortable. He fixed it up little by little, always careful not to disturb anyone. He followed the basic rules. Trash went out on time. The grass stayed short. The fence stayed the same color. He waved politely to neighbors but never forced conversation. He liked peace more than anything. The neighborhood had an HOA, but at first it barely crossed his mind. When he signed the papers, he skimmed through the rules. It seemed simple enough. No loud noise late at night, no broken cars in driveways, no wild paint colors. It all sounded reasonable. He assumed the HOA existed to keep things organized, not to control people. For the first few months, nothing happened. He settled into a routine. Morning coffee on the porch, work during the day, evenings spent reading or fixing small things around the house. On weekends, he cleaned the yard and washed his car. Life felt steady again. Then one afternoon, a letter appeared in his mailbox. The envelope looked official. Plain paper, printed address. No return name, just the HOA logo in the corner. Didn't feel worried at first. He assumed it was a newsletter or some reminder about a meeting. He opened it inside his kitchen and read it slowly. The letter said he was in violation of HOA rules. Claimed his trash bin had been left visible for too long after pickup day. According to the letter, this was not allowed. He was warned that future violations could result in fines. He reread the letter twice. Trash bin? Was sure he always rolled it back behind the fence the same day. Maybe he was late once. It didn't feel like a big deal. He shrugged and placed the letter on the counter. Okay, he said quietly to himself. I'll be extra careful. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel threatened. He believed it was just a reminder sent to many people. He moved on with his day. A week later, another letter arrived. This time the tone felt colder. The letter mentioned his lawn. It said, one corner near the sidewalk looked uneven and needed attention. It included a deadline. Fix it within 5 days or face a fine. That caught his attention. That same morning, he walked outside and looked at the lawn. It looked fine to him. Maybe one small patch near the edge wasn't perfect, but it was not overgrown. It didn't look neglected. He wondered who even noticed something so small. Still, he didn't want trouble. That afternoon, he trimmed the edge again and watered the area. He even took photos, just in case. A few neighbors watched quietly from their windows. No one said anything, no one smiled. It felt strange, but he ignored it. The next letter came faster. This one mentioned his porch decorations, a simple chair and a small plant. According to the HOA, the items were not approved and needed to be removed or replaced. That was the moment something felt off. The chair had been there since he moved in. Other houses had chairs, tables, even small statues. Why was his a problem? That evening he finally heard a name. While taking out the mail, a neighbor from across the street spoke softly, almost like a warning. You might want to be careful, the neighbor said. She's watching. He asked who she was, but the neighbor only shook his head and went back inside. A day later, he met her. He was cleaning his car in the driveway when a woman walked up the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. Her steps were sharp and confident. She stopped at the edge of his driveway and cleared her throat. Are you the homeowner here? She asked. He nodded. Yes. I'm with the HOA, she said, holding up the clipboard. We've had several issues with your property. Her voice was firm, almost proud. She didn't smile. He stayed calm. I've fixed everything mentioned in the letters. She glanced around, eyes moving quickly, like she was searching for something else to point out. Well, she said, we'll see about that. She pointed toward the porch. Those items aren't approved. They were here when I moved in, he replied. And I've seen similar items on other porches. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Other homeowners are not the issue right now. You are? That sentence stayed with him. He felt a small knot form in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. If there's a form or approval process, I'm happy to follow it. She tapped her clipboard. You should have done that already." She turned and walked away without another word. From that day on, things changed. He noticed her car parked nearby more often. Sometimes she walked past his house slowly, pretending to check her phone while clearly looking at his yard. Once he caught her taking pictures. More letters followed. One mentioned the color of his fence. Another mentioned the placement of his car in the driveway. Each letter sounded more serious than the last. Fines were mentioned more often. Deadlines grew shorter. He started feeling uneasy in his own home. Still, he didn't react. He didn't argue. He fixed what he could and documented everything. Photos, dates, times. He kept every letter in a folder at night. He sat at the kitchen table reading the HOA rules more carefully. Some of the violations didn't even match what was written. Others were vague, leaving too much room for interpretation. He began to realize this wasn't about rules. It felt personal. Neighbors avoided eye contact now. Conversations stopped when he walked by. It was like everyone knew something he did. One evening, he overheard two people talking while he watered the lawn. "She's at it again," one whispered. "He seems nice," another replied. "I don't know why she's targeting him." Targeting, that word, confirmed what he already felt. The final moment of part one came quietly. Late one afternoon, returned home from work to find a bright notice taped to his front door. It warned of an upcoming inspection. It listed multiple possible violations that hadn't even happened yet. He stood there for a long moment, holding the paper, feeling the weight of it sink in. This was no longer about small mistakes. This was about control. Inside the house, he placed the notice in his folder and sat down. He didn't feel panic. He didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. He realized that the calm neighborhood he moved into wasn't as peaceful as it looked. And he understood something important. Someone had decided to push him, and they had no idea how far that push would eventually go. He woke up the next morning with a quiet determination. The first part of his plan was simple. Stay calm and keep careful records. Every letter, every conversation, every visit by the HOA woman, he documented it all. It was like keeping a diary, but for safety and fairness. He had learned early that patience mattered more than anger. Even though anger wanted to rise, the woman, the HOA president, seemed unstoppable at first. She walked through the neighborhood, like she owned it, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for anything she could call a violation. He noticed the way neighbors shifted when she approached, whispering quietly or disappearing into their homes. Most people didn't speak up, afraid of becoming her next target. It created an invisible tension that draped over the street like a heavy blanket. He felt the pressure, but he refused to give in. One Saturday, she came by without warning. He was on the front porch, watering a few plants. The sunlight made the leaves shine, and birds flitted between the branches. For a moment, it felt like peace again. Then she appeared at the end of the driveway, sharp steps clicking against the pavement. "Are you the homeowner?" she asked, voice cold and precise. "Yes," he replied calmly. She pointed toward his car. "It's parked incorrectly. Need to adjust it immediately or you'll be fined." He followed her gaze, confused. His car was exactly where he had always parked it, in the driveway, inside the marked area. "It's within the driveway," he said. "I don't see a problem." Her eyes narrowed. "Rules are rules," she said firmly. "Others have adjusted. You should too." He smiled slightly, trying to keep the mood light. "I'll look into it. Thank you." She didn't respond. She left as abruptly as she had arrived, but he noticed the way she glanced back, measuring, assessing, looking for anything she could use. The letters kept coming, each one more detailed than the last. Some were about his lawn, some about decorations, and some about things he didn't even know could be a problem. The constant scrutiny weighed on him, but he focused on small victories. He fixed minor issues and kept taking pictures of everything. Neighbors began reacting differently now. A few would greet him in passing, offering cautious smiles, but others avoided him entirely. Rumors spread that he was difficult or uncooperative. But the reality was simple. He was following the rules as best as he could while being unfairly targeted. One day, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered across the street, whispering and pointing. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but their expressions showed curiosity and concern. For the first time, he realized he wasn't entirely alone. Some people were watching and noticing what was happening. The tension grew when she tried to escalate things further. One morning, he found a notice on his door about a new inspection. It demanded he remove personal items from his porch and backyard that had been there for years. Some of the items were small decorations or garden tools. None of them caused harm or were unsightly. They were simply part of his home. He sighed, feeling the frustration rise, but refusing to let it control him. Instead of reacting with anger, he decided to prepare. He researched the HOA rules more thoroughly, reviewing every paragraph, every guideline. He noted which complaints were valid and which were exaggerated or entirely fabricated. He even created a spreadsheet with dates, times, photographs to document compliance. The HOA woman escalated further, sending letters that implied legal action. She included threats of fines and removal of property. He read each letter carefully, making notes and keeping them in his folder. He knew that remaining calm and organized would be his strongest defense. A turning point came when she arrived at his house with a neighbor in tow. This time, she was more aggressive, pointing at small cracks in the sidewalk and suggesting they were violations. The neighbor, someone he barely knew, seemed unsure whether to intervene or support her. He stayed calm, explaining politely that the cracks were minor and had been there for years. She snapped, her voice rising. "That doesn't matter. You must fix them." He shook his head. "I understand your concern, but these cracks do not pose a safety issue. And the HOA rules don't specify this as a violation. I'm happy to address anything that is formally required, but I cannot comply with demands that aren't clearly stated in the rules." The woman's face turned red with frustration. She looked at the neighbor and then back at him. For the first time, he noticed a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. He didn't push. He simply stood firm, quiet but unwavering. After she left, he reviewed the events carefully. He realized that staying calm, organized, and polite was slowly shifting the dynamic. The more aggressive she became, the more careful and measured he remained. It was like watching a storm approach. The wind roared, lightning struck, but he stayed under shelter, waiting for the rain to pass. Neighbors began to notice his composure. A few started asking quietly about the letters and the fines. They wanted advice and guidance, unsure how to handle the same woman who seemed to control everything. He shared what he had learned. Always document, remain calm, and never engage in arguments. The advice spread slowly, building a subtle network of understanding. One evening, he sat on his porch reflecting on the weeks of letters, visits, and whispered warnings. He realized that, while the HOA woman had tried to intimidate him, she had revealed her own weaknesses. Her decisions were impulsive, and her sense of authority depended on fear, not respect. At that moment, he decided he would no longer just react. He would anticipate. He would stay ahead. Every letter, every visit, every photograph she took would be used to show the truth. He would not allow intimidation to dictate his life. Life became a careful balance. He spent mornings fixing minor yard issues, taking photos for evidence. He spent afternoons at work, often thinking about potential HOA tactics. Evenings were for reviewing letters, writing responses, and documenting interactions. He found a rhythm in it, turning frustration into preparation. The neighborhood watched silently. Some were supportive, some curious, some fearful. Rumors swirled about what would happen next. The HOA woman, confident as ever, believed she had full control. She didn't realize that her constant scrutiny was creating its own record of behavior, evidence of overreach and obsession. Over time, subtle cracks appeared in her armor. She began making mistakes. Letters were sent with the wrong dates. Fines were threatened for non-existent rules. Her anger sometimes showed when she spoke, giving hints that she was losing her grip on authority. He stayed careful. He didn't celebrate small victories out loud. He didn't boast. He simply continued documenting, staying calm, preparing for the inevitable turning point when the truth would come out. The tension in the neighborhood grew. Conversations in yards and across fences hinted at a growing awareness. People noticed that one homeowner was standing firm, refusing to be intimidated. Some admired it silently, while others worried about what would come next. He learned something important through all of this: patience. Calmness and preparation were more powerful than shouting or arguing. Each interaction with the HOA woman became a small lesson. She wanted reaction. He gave none. She wanted chaos. He gave order as part 2 drew to a close. He understood the situation clearly. The struggle was not just about fences, lawns, or chairs. It was about control, fairness, and boundaries. The HOA woman had started a conflict she believed she could win. He realized that if he continued carefully documenting and following rules, she would eventually face the limits of her own authority, and quietly. In the background of the calm streets, the neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The first real cracks in her confidence were beginning to show, and the moment when her overconfidence would meet reality was slowly approaching. The stage was set for what was coming. The homeowner knew he had to remain patient, careful, and vigilant. Every interaction mattered. Every letter counted. Every witness could become a voice of truth. He leaned back in his chair, letting the evening air fill his lungs. The street was quiet. Birds were settling in the trees. The sun dipped low behind the rooftops. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small sense of control, not because he could stop her, but because he knew he could handle whatever came next. The battle for fairness and peace in the neighborhood had begun. It was subtle, slow, and invisible to most, but it was real, and he was ready for it. He had been careful for weeks, documenting every letter, every visit, and every complaint from the HOA president. Each day felt like a small battle, but he handled it with quiet patience. That patience, he knew, was his strongest weapon. But even patience has limits when someone pushes too far. It started one Tuesday morning. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the quiet street. He stepped outside to get the mail and noticed something unusual. The HOA woman's car parked, usually close to his driveway. Normally, she would drive slowly past or walk, clipboard in hand. Today, she was sitting in the car, watching. For a moment, he wondered if she had noticed him noticing her, but he quickly reminded himself to stay calm. He opened the mailbox, pulled out a thick envelope, and walked back to the porch. Inside was a notice of a new inspection. This inspection was unlike the others. It wasn't just about minor violations or rules. This one threatened to fine him for things that were not even addressed in the HOA documents. It claimed that several areas of his property, his backyard, his porch, and even a corner of his driveway, were out of compliance. The notice included vague language that seemed almost impossible to follow perfectly. He read it carefully, word by word, and then he reread it. Each paragraph felt more aggressive than the last. The tone had changed from administrative to personal. It was no longer about rules. It was about control. He understood immediately. She was escalating. That evening, she came to the house. Not just passing by, but intentionally walking up the driveway. He was outside trimming a bush, keeping up appearances. She stopped at the edge of the driveway, eyes sharp, clipboard ready. "Have you received the inspection notice?" she asked, voice cold. "Yes," he replied calmly. She tapped the paper with her pen. "I'll be inspecting every part of your property. Anything out of compliance will be fined immediately." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I'll make sure everything is in order for you." She raised an eyebrow. "You will not just comply, you will correct. Even the things that might seem small or insignificant." He felt a knot in his stomach, but didn't show it. Instead, he smiled politely and went back to his bush. She watched him for a moment, then walked around the side of the house, taking pictures. Every click of her camera made him tighten his grip on the pruning shears. This time, he realized she was overstepping. Inspecting property without clear rules or consent was one thing. Entering property or taking pictures of personal items without permission was another. He went inside and pulled out his folder. Organizing the letters, photographs, and notes he had accumulated over weeks, he could already see how this inspection could backfire on her. Every action she took left evidence. Every letter, every photograph, every unfair accusation was now a record of her overreach. The next few days were tense. She appeared at the property several times, sometimes just walking past, sometimes standing and taking notes. He never confronted her aggressively. He never shouted or cursed. He simply documented. Neighbors started noticing. A few quietly asked him what was going on, sharing stories about their own minor complaints. They seemed relieved to see someone standing firm but cautious about becoming involved themselves. He explained calmly, "Document everything. Stay polite. Do not argue. If she oversteps, it will show itself in the record." One afternoon, the line was crossed. He was working in the backyard when he noticed her trying to reach over the fence. She wasn't supposed to enter the property without consent, but she was clearly inspecting things that were off limits. He walked over slowly. "Excuse me," he said firmly. "You cannot go past this fence without permission." She looked up, surprised, but didn't step back immediately. "I'm just inspecting," she said. "This is part of your compliance review." "I understand that," he said calmly. "But you cannot enter private property without permission. That is trespassing." Her face hardened. "You will not stop me from doing my job." He remained steady. "I'm asking you, politely, to step back. You can inspect from the other side of the fence. Anything beyond this line is private." After a tense moment, she stepped back, muttering something under her breath. He watched carefully, then went back to trimming the plants. But he knew this was significant. He had caught her crossing a legal boundary, and he had done it without escalating into an argument. Over the next few weeks, the tension in the neighborhood escalated. Letters continued to arrive, each one more threatening than the last. She demanded removal of harmless decorations, adjustments to landscaping, and changes to items he had owned for years. He responded politely to each letter, following the rules when possible, but never overreacting. Each response was documented. Every photo was time-stamped. Every interaction logged. Then came the evening of the HOA board meeting. She had called for a review of several properties, including his. He decided to attend. He didn't go to argue or plead. He went to observe, gather information, present facts calmly if needed. Inside the meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. Some neighbors were whispering, watching quietly. She stood at the front, clipboard in hand, presenting her complaints with a dramatic flair. Her voice was sharp, commanding attention. "This homeowner has ignored multiple notices, failed to comply with basic rules, and continues to display items that are not allowed." He waited for his turn. When it came, he spoke clearly, calmly, and respectfully. He presented evidence, photographs, dated letters, records of compliance. He pointed out where rules were vague or inconsistently enforced. He never insulted her. He never raised his voice. He simply laid out facts. The room grew quiet. Some board members whispered among themselves. Neighbors shifted in their seats. The woman's confidence began to waver ever so slightly. Her tone changed. Her statements became defensive. He could see the realization slowly dawning. She had pushed too far, and it was visible to others. After the meeting, he returned home. He felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, not because he had won, but because he had acted with integrity and patience. He had stayed calm under pressure, and the truth had begun to show itself. That night, he reviewed the week's events in his folder. The pattern was clear. Every aggressive move she made left a trail of evidence. Every overstep, every unfair threat, every unnecessary inspection could now be used to show that she had abused her authority for the first time. He felt a real sense of control, not because the HOA woman had stopped her actions, but because he understood how to respond. Patience.com and careful documentation had become his strongest tools. Neighbors began noticing subtle changes in her behavior. She became more cautious. She hesitated before sending letters. She walked more slowly past his property, measuring reactions. It was as if the first cracks in her armor were appearing. He knew the conflict was far from over. She had made a mistake in underestimating him, and he intended to let her continue making those mistakes scarefully and without confrontation till the truth could no longer be ignored. In his backyard, He sat quietly that evening, looking at the setting sun. The street was calm, but the tension was still there. The HOA woman had crossed boundaries, and she had done so in front of witnesses. He had remained calm, recorded everything, and followed the rules. He understood the importance of restraint. He knew that every overreaction could give her power. By remaining measured, he had taken away her most dangerous weapon, intimidation. The stage was now set. The conflict had escalated to a point where her own behavior could no longer be ignored. He had stayed calm, collected evidence, and observed carefully. He knew that the next steps would be critical. The HOA woman had pushed too far. The moment when the truth would come out, when her overreach would be revealed, was approaching, and he would be ready. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the cool evening air on his face. The neighborhood was quiet, almost peaceful, but he knew that beneath the calm surface, change was coming. The HOA woman's confidence was faltering. The balance of power was slowly shifting. He had survived the first waves of intimidation. He had stayed patient, calm, and organized. Now, the real turning point was near. The moment when she would realize she had made a huge mistake was approaching. And he would be there, prepared, ready to meet it with calm. Clear truth, the tension, the waiting. The careful observation, all of it had brought him closer to the inevitable moment of justice. And quietly he smiled, knowing that patience and integrity were stronger than fear and aggression. The week after the board meeting began with a quiet tension in the neighborhood. He could feel it in the air, the kind of silence that comes when people are waiting for something important to happen. For him, the waiting was not passive. He had spent weeks documenting every letter, photographing every corner of his property, recording dates and interactions. Now, all of it was about to be useful in a way he had hoped for, but never rushed. It started with a call from the HOA board. They wanted to meet with him and a few other residents to review concerns about the recent inspections. The woman had submitted reports about multiple properties, including his, claiming repeated violations. He accepted the meeting calmly, preparing notes, photos, and the carefully organized folder he had been keeping for months. When he arrived, the tension in the room was noticeable. A few neighbors were present, sitting quietly, eyes shifting from him to the board members. The board consisted of 3 people, and for the first time, he noticed that they didn't seem entirely comfortable. The HOA woman was there too, standing with her clipboard as usual. But her posture seemed a little less confident than before. The board began the meeting by reviewing the complaints she had submitted. She spoke first, pointing to his property, describing supposed violations. Her voice was strong, confident, almost triumphant. But as she spoke, he noticed a subtle shift in the board members' expressions. One of them frowned slightly. Another exchanged a quick glance with a neighbor. The confidence she had carried for weeks began to waver. When it was his turn, he spoke slowly and clearly, presenting the evidence he had collected. He started with the earliest letters she had sent, showing that he had complied with all legitimate requests. Then he showed photos of his property taken before, during, and after the supposed violations. He demonstrated that the items she had complained about were either already approved, harmless, or within the rules. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue emotionally. He simply presented facts, organized and precise. The room grew quiet. Every eye shifted to the documents, the photographs, and the notes he had taken. The HOA woman's confident tone began to falter. Her points sounded less certain as he methodically disproved them. And she realized that the evidence she had relied on was being contradicted. The board members began asking questions. When were these letters sent? One asked, "Are there records of previous violations for this homeowner?" Another inquired. He answered calmly, pointing to the dates and the photographs. Each answer exposed a small crack in her story. Her own reports now looked exaggerated, incomplete, and in some cases, false. Neighbors began to speak quietly as well. They shared observations they had made over the past few weeks, small but telling incidents that supported his claims. One neighbor mentioned seeing her take photographs from inappropriate angles. Another noted that she had entered private areas without permission. Slowly the room shifted. The perception of control she had built up over the neighborhood began to unravel. It was a turning point. For the first time, she realized that her actions were being scrutinized in a way she could not control. The board members looked at her with concern, questioning some of her reports. She tried to regain authority, repeating her claims, but the calm, factual presentation of evidence made her arguments fall flat. She could no longer intimidate with fear or assert dominance through aggressive language. He continued carefully, showing examples of inconsistencies in the rules she cited and highlighting areas where she had overstepped. Every letter, every inspection, every comment she had made was now visible to others as part of a clear pattern. The room grew more aware, the tension palpable. At one point, a board member leaned forward. These claims about property violations, they don't seem to be supported by evidence. The homeowner has complied where necessary and has documented everything else. The HOA woman's face flushed with frustration. She opened her mouth to respond, but paused. There was hesitation in her eyes, a recognition that her position was slipping. She was no longer in full control. By the end of the meeting, the board had made several decisions. They dismissed the most serious accusations against him, citing lack of evidence and overreach. They issued a warning to the HOA woman herself, instructing her to follow proper protocols and to stop entering private property without permission. It was a quiet but decisive moment. The balance of power had shifted. As he walked home, he noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Neighbors greeted him with small smiles and quiet nods. Some whispered congratulations. Others seemed relieved. The tension that had hung over the street for weeks began to ease. People were noticing that fairness could prevail, and that intimidation could be confronted without aggression. When he arrived home, he placed the board's decision and all supporting documents into his folder. He reviewed everything, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment, not prideful or boastful, but a calm satisfaction that truth and patience had prevailed. That night, he sat on his porch watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. The street was quiet, almost peaceful. But unlike before, the peace felt earned. It was not the quiet of fear or control, it was the quiet of restored balance. The calm after standing firm without losing integrity. Over the next few days, the HOA woman became noticeably more cautious. She continued her rounds, but with hesitation. Letters were sent less frequently, and inspections were limited to clearly defined rules. Her previous confidence was replaced by a quiet tension. The first real acknowledgement that her approach had consequences. Neighbors began to speak more openly. Some shared stories of their own minor interactions with the HOA, using his example to advocate for fairness. Slowly, the neighborhood began to shift from quiet fear to cautious empowerment. People realized that rules were meant to serve the community, not to control it through intimidation. He continued to maintain his routine, staying careful, documenting interactions, and ensuring compliance with legitimate rules. But there was a difference now. The HOA woman's overreach had been exposed, and she knew that her actions were visible to others. Her authority was no longer absolute. In private moments, he reflected on the weeks of tension, letters, and inspections. He realized that the key had been patience, organization, and calmness. He had refused to be drawn into emotional arguments or intimidation tactics. Instead, he had created a clear record of the truth, and that truth had spoken louder than fear. Neighbors began to approach him for advice, asking how to handle minor complaints or inspections. He shared simple guidance: document everything, stay calm, follow rules, and do not let fear dictate responses. His advice spread quietly, helping others navigate a system that had once seemed overwhelming. The HOA woman continued to circulate through the neighborhood, but her influence was diminished. Her confidence had been shaken, her reports scrutinized, and her authority questioned. For the first time, she experienced the consequences of pushing too far, of attempting to control through fear rather than fairness. One afternoon, he noticed her standing near the edge of the street, hesitating before taking notes. She looked around as if considering whether to proceed or retreat. He did not confront her. He simply observed, understanding that the moment of realization had arrived. She knew at last that she had misjudged the situation. The balance of power had shifted, and the neighborhood felt it. People walked a little taller, smiled a little more freely, and spoke with greater confidence. The atmosphere of intimidation had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of fairness and community. He continued to live quietly, tending to his home, maintaining his property, and interacting politely with neighbors. But he remained vigilant, knowing that overreach could return if unchecked. His careful documentation and calm approach had proven effective, and he remained prepared to maintain the balance he had helped restore by the end of Part 4. The neighborhood had learned a powerful lesson. Intimidation could be challenged with patience, organization, and truth. The HOA woman had faced the consequences of her actions, and the homeowner had emerged not as a conqueror, but as someone who had protected fairness and integrity through careful, deliberate effort. The moment of revelation for the HOA woman had arrived. She had overstepped, her authority had been questioned, and her confidence had been shaken. The homeowner had remained calm and human, using reason and careful preparation to show that overreach and intimidation could be confronted without anger or aggression. The street felt different now. There was a quiet respect in the air. Neighbors spoke more freely. Children played a little louder. The sense of fear and tension that had lingered was gone. And in the center of it all, the homeowner had shown that integrity and patience were more powerful than intimidation and control. The stage was set for the final part. The HOA woman had realized her mistake. The neighborhood had witnessed it, and the homeowner had established a new balance of fairness. The final chapter would show how that realization changed everything. Not through confrontation, but through the quiet, undeniable power of truth and persistence. The morning after the board's decision, the neighborhood felt lighter, almost as if a heavy weight had been lifted. He stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air, and noticed subtle changes. Neighbors greeted him with quiet smiles, a small acknowledgement of the difficult weeks they had all silently endured. Some waved from across the street, others paused briefly to nod or offer kind words. The street that had once felt tense and watchful now carried a fragile but growing sense of relief. For him, the past weeks had been a careful test of patience and perseverance. Every letter, visit, and complaint had been a challenge, not just to his patience, but to his sense of fairness and security. The HOA woman had tried to assert control in ways that overstepped rules, invaded privacy, and created unnecessary stress. But he had handled each situation calmly, documenting everything and presenting facts clearly whenever possible. Now, all of that effort began to show its results. The HOA woman appeared later that day, walking slowly past his property. Her usual confident stride seemed smaller, measured, as if she were walking through a space where her influence no longer held the same weight. She glanced toward him, and he noticed the shift in her eyes, a mix of surprise, hesitation, and something that looked like the first real acknowledgement of her mistake. She no longer approached with certainty. Instead, she maintained a distance, aware that her previous tactics had been ineffective. Neighbors were observing as well. A few stepped outside to tend to their yards, talking quietly amongst themselves. He noticed one family across the street, who had previously avoided him, now giving a subtle wave. Children played in front yards, their laughter a sign that the oppressive atmosphere had begun to lift. The street, once tense and silent, was regaining life. He spent the afternoon documenting small improvements, not because of fear, but as a personal routine to maintain clarity and order. He trimmed the edges of the lawn, adjusted minor decorations on the porch, and took notes and photographs of everything. His actions were calm, deliberate, and steady. He was reclaiming his space, not in defiance, but through thoughtful care. Later, a neighbor came by. She was someone who had quietly observed the previous weeks, but had been hesitant to speak. "I wanted to say, you handled everything so well," she said. Her voice was low, almost hesitant, as if speaking too loudly might draw attention. "I was afraid she would come after me too. But seeing how calm and organized you stayed, it gave me hope," he smiled politely. "The key is to remain calm, document everything, and follow the rules carefully. Intimidation only works if you react emotionally. Patience and clarity are stronger than fear." She nodded, clearly relieved. It's nice to know someone stood up without causing more problems. The conversation was brief, but it confirmed something important. His approach had not only protected his own peace, but had quietly empowered others. People had begun to see that standing firm with calm reasoning could change the dynamic, even against someone who tried to control through fear. That evening, the HOA board sent a final notice confirming the dismissal of the most serious claims against him. They reminded all residents, including the HOA woman, that inspections must follow proper procedures and respect private property. It was a formal acknowledgement that overreach and intimidation were unacceptable. The HOA woman received the notice as well. For the first time, she had clear limits placed on her authority. She read the letter, and for a long moment, she sat silently. Her expression showed a quiet recognition that she had misjudged the situation, that she had pushed too far, and that her aggressive actions had consequences she had not anticipated. Over the next few days, her behavior changed. She walked past properties more cautiously, refraining from unnecessary inspections or harsh letters. When she did approach, her tone was neutral, almost hesitant, as if she were aware that any misstep could be documented and challenged. The once confident, controlling presence she projected had been replaced with restraint and careful observation. The neighborhood began to respond as well. Conversations became more open. Neighbors discussed minor issues without fear of intimidation. There was a sense of shared understanding that fairness mattered more than rigid enforcement. The oppressive atmosphere that had lingered for weeks was replaced with cautious optimism. He continued his routine, tending to his home and maintaining his property. But now, there was a sense of ease in his actions. He no longer feared arbitrary complaints or aggressive inspections. His calm, methodical approach had created an environment where fairness and clarity prevailed. One afternoon, he noticed the HOA woman speaking quietly with a board member. She glanced toward him, and for a brief moment their eyes met. There was no anger, no confrontation, only acknowledgement. She had realized the impact of her actions, and he understood that she would think twice before attempting similar intimidation again.